See now that I am he. There's no God besides me. I put to death, I make alive, I have wounded, it is I who heal. In John's gospel, one of the things that he selects out of that larger pool of things that Jesus said and did is this way of referring to himself, the I am statements. Remember, John tells us that Jesus said and did many things, and he didn't put them all in the book. That means that he's being selective. He's choosing those things that are relevant to some of the issues that he's talking about. And the same thing is true in the other gospels, right? They're emphasizing certain points. And one thing that we see in John's gospel is he likes to tell us about those I am statements. There's two classes of this. There's the I am statements with a predicate, like I am the bread of life, I am the resurrection and the life, right? I am the light of the world, these sorts of things. And then there are absolute I am statements without a predicate. It's just I am. And you're thinking, I am what? Right. But when you see them in their context, it becomes apparent that these are ways of identifying himself as deity. This way of speaking is often assumed to go back to Exodus 3:14, but actually goes back to other things in the Hebrew Bible. In Deuteronomy 32:39, for example, it says, see now that I am he. There's no God besides me. I put to death, I make alive, I have wounded, it is I who heal. And there's nobody who can deliver out of my hand. In the English translation, it renders it I am he, but in Hebrew, it's anihu. In Greek, it's ego eimi. And normally would be, if we just translate it strictly, it would be I am. That's the same expression that Jesus uses several times in John's gospel, ego eimi. Translators sometimes complete it by adding the word he, which obscures it. The he is not necessary. It's without a predicate. He simply says, I am. The most well-known example of this, which really brings out the force of it, is John 8:58, when the Jews say, you're not 50 years old and you've seen Abraham. Jesus replies, before Abraham became, I am. So here you have a pointed contrast. Abraham became. Jesus, by contrast, says, I am. He uses this absolute way of speaking about himself that indicates eternal existence, in contrast to the temporal becoming of Abraham. This is, again, a very prominent emphasis in John. If you go back to John's prologue, really everything you see happening in the narrative is John unpacking the prologue. The prologue sets you up for what you're going to see in the narrative. What does John do at the very outset of the prologue? He makes a contrast between the eternal nature of Christ and the becoming of everything else. In John 1:1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, uses the imperfect tense, meaning when everything began, the Word already was. It says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Then it says, all things, here's the literal Greek, became through him. And without him, nothing became that has become. So you have this contrast between the Word who always was and everything else that became. So this is a way of identifying himself as the Lord of the Old Testament. So when you look at something like John 18, when the cohort goes to apprehend Jesus, Jesus is ensuring that his disciples are not swept up in this, right? It even quotes an Old Testament text that I've not lost any of those that you've given to me, right? Old Testament predicted that the shepherd would be struck and the sheep would be scattered, but none of them would perish in that event. And so Jesus ensures that all they end up doing is arresting him. And so when they say, we seek Jesus of Nazareth, he says, I am, and that causes them to draw back and fall to the ground. And then, it happens again. And basically it shows Christ's control in the situation. They're not taking him because they had power over him. It was rather something that was granted to them, right? Jesus is controlling it all along. They'd have no power over him unless it were given them from above. And he's demonstrating that by, causing them to fall back.